So it turns out I'm not going to be in class on Saturday, the 28th. Anyways, I think I mentioned before that I had two engagements, one on the 21st and one on the 28th. And initially, I was afraid that I wouldn't be able to do both. I talked to my department head, and he said that as long as I provided kind of instructions and kind of a virtual class, that I could miss two. So, anyway, so I'm going to go ahead and record a lecture. I'll probably do this in a couple of phases. So that way it's not too long. But this will kind of give you the content that you need. And then when we meet, which we won't meet again until October 5th, that will be kind of reinforcing this, and I think I might plan to do an activity or something like that. So anyways, just so you know, I'm always available by email. If you have any questions, please let me know. I can arrange to meet next Saturday between 8 and 9 if you want, or maybe 8 and 9:15. So that is an option, just in case you have some big pressing question that you feel like you need to have answered. So anyways, let me go ahead and get started talking about reform and action. So first off, we're talking about the period, I put on here 1840 to 1865. Really, you could argue it goes back a little bit before then, because these movements kind of get started. It's all tangled up with the idea of the market economy and the idea of Western expansion. And again, the prevailing question is, if you have a market economy where people are being paid wages, say that fast 3 times, where they're being paid wages instead of owning their own land or owning their own business or being their own artisan, do they have kind of this investment in society, right? So this is the big prevailing question. This is the world that our founding fathers didn't imagine. You might argue that Hamilton kind of saw it, but most of the others did not, particularly those like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. So the question of how do we take this market economy and turn it into a free society? And especially in light of the competition and the fact that competition often brings out the worst in people. And so you kind of have the outcome of this big kind of philosophical question, right? In addition, the market economy, because it diffuses the pressures of the economy and of society, local control is much less significant, right? So it doesn't matter that your community had a strong church or a strong religious background or anything like that. Now, you're basically very, very susceptible to this national identity. In fact, national identity begins to come to the forefront. We see that a little bit with the War of 1812. We certainly see it with the Mexican-American War, but this idea of nationalism, not that they would have termed it as nationalism then, but that's absolutely what it is, right? And this whole market economy begins to layer in this class structure. And one thing you should remember that the colonial period was kind of like a hamburger, right? Where everybody was kind of in the middle. And what happens with the market economy is it takes that hamburger and it turns it into a triangle. And suddenly you have people who, that are at the top of the social ladder. And this is true in the Northeast as well as it is in the South. There was some acceptance that in the South you had slaves and then you had non-slaves. But in the North, of course, up until you get to the market economy, you had this kind of equalizing aspect to the economy. And that completely changes because of the market economy. So you've got this wrestling with what does it mean to be an American in this new system. And it's out of this, because of the rise of the market economy, the rise of industrialization, that you have the middle class emerging. And the middle class emerges with a separate identity. And again, some of the things we've talked about, the cult of domesticity, the idea that women had very specific roles. You started to have people kind of smaller families, not for all, but for some effort. Some of this has to do with presumptions about women's sexuality, that women didn't like sex and that a good woman didn't like sex, and that prostitutes, these loose women, almost that sexuality was a mental illness for a lot of women. So that tended to result in smaller families, women as consumers, and that kind of thing. And so this begins to change the way society functions in many, many ways. So the foundation of reform is going to largely be these two movements. One of them is the Second Great Awakening, and the other one is Romanticism. The Second Great Awakening is absolutely a religious movement. We've talked about kind of the First Great Awakening, kind of this rise of Methodism and Baptists and that kind of thing that talked about personal salvation, and kind of personal, taking this idea of personal piety, but making it about repentance and being accountable to God, and having kind of this independence, that helps create the foundation for the American Revolution. Well, the Second Great Awakening happens in the early 1800s, about 100 years later. And this is another kind of idea of Christian values. It focuses on salvation, but it's salvation through action. In other words, I do things to make society better. I try to make the world a better place. Perfection, right? Perfecting ourselves, perfecting our society. As well as kind of a Protestant, it's very Protestant, right? So some of this is happening in light of Irish immigration that's coming in and the concerns about Irish immigration. And so you have kind of this idea that the market economy has brought out the worst in people, right? It's brought out competition and greed, and that the Second Great Awakening says we have to push back against that. We have to focus on improving society. We have to focus on self-discipline with ourselves. And a lot of this has to do with women being very much involved in kind of this revival movement. It's not just women, it's men too, but women are a big part of this movement. And then the next part of it is going to be the idea of Romanticism, right? This is expressed often in art and literature, but because you have a growing middle class, and the middle class stereotypically has a little bit of free time to read or to go to plays or to do that kind of thing, they're partaking of this particular art and literature and performance and that kind of thing. And so what Romanticism emphasizes is individual expression, right? There's lots of reference to emotion, what you feel, which kind of dovetails with the Second Great Awakening, this idea of repentance and salvation being something that you seek. And it really kind of questions the factory, right? Questions it as a dehumanizing, kind of force within society. And so, like, the best example is Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And she writes that story specifically talking about kind of factories and machinery and science and technology, and how it's removing kind of humanity from people, and how we should try to get back in touch with who we are, which in many ways is an artistic focus, like you see with kind of the Second Great Awakening. Let me get back in touch with my spirituality. Let me get back in touch with what makes me a whole person, and how do I make the world around me a better place, right? So that's kind of what they're talking about. And then you're going to see that in the midst of all of this, you're going to have a number of communities that come out of this. Some of these are utopian communities. Some of them are very religious. So some of these might sound a little bit familiar. All of these communities are trying to do the same thing that the Second Great Awakening and Romanticism is trying to do, which is preserve humanity, right? We've got this growing marketplace, and we've got all this competition and greed, and we've got industrialization and factory work that kind of takes meaning out of the idea of working. How do we find a way to resolve that competition and industrialization? So the three communities that I kind of wanted to focus on are the Transcendentalists, right? Transcendentalists are probably, if you've ever read Little Women, that's that book, and goodness gracious, Louisa May Alcott. If you ever read Louisa May Alcott or watched a movie about Little Women, she was a transcendentalist. Her family were transcendentalists. These are people that often focus on kind of improving the human condition through, first and foremost, communing with nature, right? Going out and kind of recognizing God all around you, that God's in the sunset, he's in the trees, all this kind of stuff, and kind of getting a sense of your own insignificance, if you will. So that's some of it. It also translates into the idea that you are just a small person, that you can make a small difference in your community. But it's very much tied to kind of separating yourself, creating a haven, if you will, if nothing else than a haven within the home. So there were some transcendentalists that don't embrace these faraway communities, that focus on kind of creating that haven, that kind of individualized expression there of their house. But other times it involved moving away, right? There's a place called Brook Farm. And Brook Farm is the transcendentalist community that was set up in order to try and promote the idea of kind of this utopianism, that if we all come out and we all commune with nature, we're not susceptible to greed and corruption and all these kinds of things, that we'll have this perfect society and things will run well. Problem with Brook Farm is like kind of the 1960s, utopian kind of hippie communes. It gets hard to get people to do the work, right? And so it ends up kind of having lots of financial problems and ends up kind of going away. So that, again, sometimes transcendentalists formed like literal communities like Brook Farm. Other times they formed more of a kind of like intellectual community, where they'd get together and have salons and that kind of thing. Henry David Thoreau is probably the most famous of these. Henry David Thoreau, of course, had opposition to the Mexican-American War, refused to pay his taxes, got thrown into jail. Thoreau is the foundation of his writings influenced Martin Luther King. So again, this idea that I, as the individual, I commune with nature, commune with God. I find my own sense of right and wrong based on what God shows me in nature, and therefore I live that out regardless of what society says. Then you have some other utopian communities, like you had Cane Ridge for the Shakers. The Shakers are kind of interesting, founded by a woman who actually believed in that you didn't have sexual relations, men and women were segregated, but men and women were equal, right? So she was the leader of the church, and everyone had equal footing. And so the Shakers, of course, they're called the Shakers because some of their religious activities meant that they kind of shaked and quaked and stuff. And so they end up making the furniture. That's what they become most famous for. But because they don't believe in sex, what's going to end up happening is that sorry, I just got an email. Is that the Shakers are going to kind of fade away because they can't replicate themselves, right? And it's hard to convince people to join them, especially as the market economy seems to be, as things are moving past that kind of initial wave of how do we find our sense of being in this new system. The next one that's kind of interesting is the Oneida community. They believed in complex marriage, basically that you could change sexual partners. Children were raised within a community. Men and women were equal. Right. So one of the common kind of standards here is a level of equality between men and women, which is kind of interesting. But then they also were going to fall apart largely because of financial pressures. And, that in society is going to have a lot of trouble with this sense of equality, and they're going to kind of push back. So I think I can find a podcast that kind of goes into more detail, but they're kind of interesting as part of this kind of reform movement. And again, this idea of women achieving equality, both spiritually and socially, right? The next group that I wanted to mention, and the last one before I kind of stop this section, is the Mormons. The Mormons are founded by Joseph Smith in New York. They kind of get persecuted. They leave New York. They go to, I think it is Nauvoo, Illinois. I think it's Illinois. And then they get attacked. Joseph Smith gets killed, and Brigham Young takes the rest of them onto Utah. And they're persecuted because their view of Christianity is very divergent from your standard Protestantism. And one of the things about the Second Great Awakening is you really see kind of this retrenchment of Protestantism as kind of a way of being. And so you have kind of people really push back against is this? And of course, the obvious reason is polygamy, right? They're allowed to have multiple wives. And this was seen as very scandalous, the fact that a man would have multiple wives. So they end up having to move to Utah. So they're part of that early wave of Western expansion, which is kind of interesting in that sense. And then you have all these communities kind of wrestling with how do we find meaning, right? That this market economy has really kind of separated people from their communities. It's made them vulnerable. Where do we find that kind of connection? And so, I mean, think about the contrast between the communities circa 1840 and the communities, say, in 1740. When you had much smaller communities, you had more people that were the same. They were basically kind of part of just providing resources to Great Britain. So they were not under as much pressure because of economic growth, right? But in the 1800s, there's a lot of economic growth, and it creates a lot of pressure. And economic insecurity, we've got lots of boom and bust cycles. All of this propels people to find a sense of meaning. And sometimes we find meaning in religious groups, sometimes we find meaning in political groups, but it tends to cause people to kind of polarize. And then simmering underneath all of this are the increasing criticisms by women of their ability to participate in the system. Not only do you have critiques by women like Abigail Adams who say, hey, what about the ladies? But then you also have women working in the factory system. And what about them? And you have middle-class women as consumers, and middle-class women and the cult of domesticity that has raised women to kind of this moral standard or this moral foundation for society. And so this is kind of why you see this questioning of what's happening. So I'll stop here and pick up next with the reform movements.